Welcome to the Climate Change Beyond the Consensus Conference. My name is Agnieszka Kolek, and I'm the Head of Cultural Engagement at MCC Brussels. I'm delighted to host you here during the first part of the conference. Before we start, I wanted to invite Frank Furedi, the Executive Director at MCC Brussels, to give a few words, followed by Callum Nicholson.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I was hoping to go after Callum so I could correct some of the errors that he's likely to make in his introduction. We are a think tank, MCC Brussels, and to me, it's the first part of that expression that's really important, which is to think. Right? Thinking is a very important human accomplishment, and it is something that over the centuries humanity has cultivated and developed, particularly in periods like the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. But suddenly, when it comes to issues to do with the environment and with climate, we seem to be discouraged from thinking. We are informed that the science has spoken, that matters are beyond debate. The United Nations assure us that they know everything. Everything has been absolutely clearly settled. And therefore, anybody whose thinking leads them in a divergent path is either malevolent or addicted to consumerism. Now, I think there are two reasons why I'm interested in this discussion today. The first reason has to do with a book I wrote back in 1997 called The Culture of Fear, which was really about the way in which fear had become politicized and instrumentalized. And one of my readers wrote a letter to me, and she said, "You know, Frank, what you were talking about, the panics that surround food, that surround children, that surround crime, that surround terrorism, those panics have acquired an incredible degree of power when it comes to the environment. And that it's quite important that we examine, and maybe you should write a book, which I never did, on the question of why it is that whenever it comes to the environment, we immediately jump without a second thought from looking at that specific problem to suggesting that what's at issue is the existence of humanity. In other words, every single time there is a problem with a polluted river, an oil slick, whenever there is something that we worry about, the desertification of part of Africa, it immediately ceases to be a technical or a social problem, and it becomes something that is calls into existence, question the existence of human beings. So that's the first reason. The second reason has got to do with the fact that I'm Hungarian. I was born in Hungary. And I remember in the Soviet era, they used to instruct us and give us policies that some idiot cobbled together in Moscow or in Siberia, and which they thought was very suitable for the Hungarian conditions. And one of the consequences of the Soviet regimes was that they basically planned out the lives of everybody. They didn't particularly care about the specific circumstances within which people lived, but instead they had policies, ready-made policies, which they took out of their pocket. And whether you were Bulgarian or Hungarian or from Yugoslavia, you were inflicted with these ideas. Not unlike what's happening in the European Union, where people in Brussels sit around late at night in the bureaucratic chambers, and basically they make it up as they go along with all kinds of policies to do with the environment. And then everybody in Europe has got to fall in line and basically accept it, because they're the experts, They got the science. They know better than we do what's in our interest. Whereas I hope what comes out of this conference is that in the end, insofar as, and whenever there are problems with the environment, they are best fixed by the people that are directly affected by them, or best dealt with in the context within which they emerge, rather than people having to react and respond to template solutions. I hope you have a good discussion, and feel free to raise criticisms, question everything, as somebody once said, and we move forward from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Now I would like Callum Nicholson, the director of Climate Policy Institute, to also address us with a few words, because I'm mindful of time.
I'll keep it
Thank
short.
you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Frank. Thank you to everyone for coming here today. So my name is Callum Nicholson. I'm director of the Climate Policy Institute in Budapest. And obviously this is a joint event between the Climate Policy Institute and MCC Brussels. I just want to say thanks to Frank and the team here, who are really fantastic for helping us put all this together. So why are we having this event, and why with this title, Climate Change Beyond the Consensus? I think we all know that, as with most things in society these days, it's a very polarized debate. Some people are labeled deniers for saying climate change either is not happening, or if it is, humans aren't responsible. And then, of course, there's the more activist side, which is saying there is a consensus. And at the Climate Policy Institute, we feel there's a missing view, and we feel this polarization is unhelpful. Because whereas the activist side of this debate tend to look at the so-called deniers and say they have too little faith in the science, which I think is often true, I think I look at the more activist side, and I think they may have the equal but opposite problem, that they often have too much faith in the social science. Why does that matter, and what do I mean by that? Well, we care about climate change because we presume that it will have a social impact that will be negative. Now, that is to make a number of assumptions, not so much about the climate, which we actually have, I think, quite good science on, but it makes a number of assumptions about society. What is society? What should society be? What are the mechanisms by which society changes? What is the causal relationship between society and extra societal factors, such as climate change? On all these sorts of questions, we don't actually have much clarity. There was a great quote from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. He said, once you've solved all the logical problems of philosophy, all the real problems of life remain untouched. And I think there's something similar when we look at the debate around climate change. Once we've solved all the problems of the science, presuming we have or that it's possible, all the real problems remain untouched, the problems of life, the problems of ourselves, the problems of society. And I think the point in saying this is that even if there is a consensus on the science, for the sake of argument, I think it's only half the battle. And I'd propose to you that when we think of climate change, yes, in my view, and some members of the panel may disagree with this, but I think, yes, the debate is informed by a rich understanding of the science, but I think it's as informed sometimes by an impoverished understanding of ourselves. So the point of this conference is to open up a bit of a debate, to explore the questions that remain to be asked, let alone answered, beyond the consensus, and to really explore the friction of views, or the spectrum of views. And I think one thing that CPI believes in, and I think MCC believes in, is the idea that friction is a dependable source of illumination. If you rub different ideas together, maybe get some heat, hopefully also some light. And so we really encourage not only, I'm looking forward to having some good discussion, even some disagreements on the panel, but also with the audience. This is a very interactive session. MCC Brussels definitely have a good sort of reputation for encouraging audience engagement. So have at it. So thank you very much.
Now I'm really honored to welcome Professor Richard Lindzen, Sloan Professor of Atmospheric Sciences Emeritus, MIT, member of US National Academy of Science, who is going to give a keynote speech, and then the panel will respond to the speech. Thank you.
It's a problem. Okay, that's fine. At any rate, Thank you. It's a pleasure being here in Brussels. A little bit tired, but in any event, what I'm going to speak on is the role of consensus in political movements that claim a scientific basis. I'm a little bit disturbed by some of the introductory remarks because I'll tell you right off the bat, the biggest problem in this that I see from the point of view of public debate is no one wants to do their homework. We'll get back to that in a moment. In any event, this is not a unique issue. There have been quite a few issues, some very serious, where science was used to crush opposition and the science was baseless, but a consensus was claimed. In the US, one issue that I've studied a bit was the exploitation of eugenics as being defined by essentially human heredity, with the discovery of the Mendel's genetic theory. One began to think of certain human qualities like simple-mindedness as being a single gene recessive property. And so the engineering aspect was you could control the intelligence of your community by selective breeding and by avoiding inferior people. This was eugenics, which everyone agreed with, the good and the powerful, in the 1920s. In America, that was used to introduce immigration restriction in 1924. It's interesting that eugenics actually is one of those things for which you have a mathematical proof that it can't work. It's known as the Hardy-Weinberg theorem. I won't go through that at this point. It didn't matter. It satisfied the needs of the politicians, and it went through. A worse example of that, of course, was the leading American exponent of eugenics and immigration policy was a scientist called Laughlin, and he was awarded in the 1930s an honorary degree from Heidelberg. And Hitler, of course, appealed to eugenics for his policies, and again insisted that there was scientific consensus. In some ways, the worst example I know of was Lysenkoism, which was a rejection of the existence of a gene, and which Stalin liked because it said that they could impose changes in their agriculture that would make it more productive just by grafting and doing things like that. And Stalin insisted that all biological scientists in the Soviet Union agree with this. He thus destroyed biology in the Soviet Union. And indeed, thousands of scientists objected and were sent to the Gulag, and several were killed. So there are ways to impose nonsense on people, and we've seen this before. The exploitation of climate fits this pattern remarkably well. And one of the things about that is in such issues, in fact, the science is irrelevant. And that's a kind of dangerous because it's a distraction. It led many of us, including myself, to look at the numerous impossibilities and errors in the theory. The statement that you feel the science has been well developed means you haven't looked at it. That's all it means. Even if you look at the IPCC, it doesn't say those things. So we'll get to that in a moment. But why do you have this? Why do you insist on this? I think it's because, and we see this time and again, consensus is claimed because most educated people know nothing about science. This is something one has to let sink in a little bit. But I mean, if I ask somebody in the humanities or the social sciences to tell me about the second law of thermodynamics, which is basic in science, I pretty much get a blank look. Maybe it's different in Belgium, but I don't know. In any event, when you have a world in which science is important and you don't know about it, you feel uneasy. And yet, as an educated person, you feel entitled to a leadership role in many respects. So this uneasiness is relieved by telling you all scientists agree. When all scientists agree, then you're safe to agree and you don't have to do your homework, as I mentioned. This is kind of a distortion of science itself. Science is a mode of inquiry. It's not a source of authority. The problem or virtue of science, depending on your opinion, is that it's been extremely successful in the modern era. And so it has earned a certain authority in the public mind. And that is something politicians don't have and envy. Now, as I say, with climate, it's similar to this. It has plenty of errors scientifically, but they're a distraction. What I'm going to describe is how this issue arose, as far as I can tell, because it really had its own origins in a certain way in the US. I'm not sure how it goes with Europe. But there were meetings, interestingly enough, in the early 80s. The Rockefeller Brothers Foundation has a center in Bellagio. They had a large meeting, largely of science administrators, to get them on board around 81, 82. Around the mid-80s, there was another such meeting in Villach in Austria, to do the same thing. So there was work to get people on board before rolling it out publicly as an issue. In any event, I think it's global, but I'll stick to the US. And I would say that the obsession with decarbonization, what we now call net zero, actually had its roots in the post-World War II period, which in the US, and I think in Europe also, was an amazing period. Why was it amazing? It was a period in which ordinary working people could now afford a house and a car and live better than they had. Remember, before World War II, we had the global depression. And the response of people who were, quote, educated elite was remarkable. I mean, I was a student in the 50s and 60s, and one characteristic of a lot of our courses was to mock the poor taste of the working middle class. Their houses were plain looking, they didn't have good taste. They were too materialistic, which is a little ironic coming from people who are well off. But this sort of simmered and came to a head during the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War in the US was one where essentially the children of the working middle class were drafted and fought, and the students, who at that time were still an elite, the period of massive expansion of education had not yet run its course. They got student deferments. So one had a split in our society, which was not true during World War II. World War II had fairly good representation, but the Vietnam War did not. And so how do you justify not wanting to serve your country? Now, one thing is to declare the war was illegitimate. we were on the wrong side, which in retrospect was a little bit absurd. I mean, people were fleeing from north to south. Nobody was fleeing to the north, which was communist. But this gave rise to a movement that took the view that the West, and in particular the US, was illegitimate, that it was worthy of being overthrown. Sounds strange at some point. It gave rise to groups like the Weather Underground, the Students for Democratic Society, that were overtly violent. They were committed to the overthrow of the government. They had nowhere near the power to do anything, but they killed a few people, had a few incidents, burnt down a city or two, and generally wrought havoc. I mentioned that we at that time, I was teaching at the University of Chicago, but we were in 1968 spending a summer at a laboratory in Colorado. So we asked a student to take care of our apartment when we were gone from Chicago. We came back at the end of the summer, and there was a police car outside our apartment. And we realized what had happened is the student had turned our apartment into a hostel or a crash pad for the Students for Democratic Society. Our apartment was messy, and there's a lot of the literature of this group there, including plans for poisoning the Chicago water supply. In any event, they essentially, we thought that this ended when Richard Nixon was elected president. But we were wrong. I mean, by now it's very well accepted that this was the beginning of Marcuse's march through the institutions, where you began taking over society by avowed revolutionaries intent on destroying Western society. There was a difference, however. This was a new Marxism, and because the enemy was not the capitalists. The enemy was the working middle class. In fact, they realized the capitalists were easy to buy off, and we can see that these days. Now, right now, there's a lot of emphasis on the march through the educational system. We realized they first took over the schools of education in the US, then humanities and the social sciences, and now, to many of our surprise, science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM. What I think we're forgetting now, and this is perhaps the most serious point, is that these were not the first institutions that were struck. Professional societies were really an easy pickup. And I'll get back to it, but my wife, for instance, during the 60s went to a meeting of the Modern Language Association in America, and that was already fully on board with all these woke ideas. At any rate, despite the focus on education, where diversity, equity, and inclusion is a movement that is somehow swept through our educational institutions and corporate America, where you emphasize racial differences and encourage conflict. But that was not the only goal. And I think it would be a big mistake to ignore the fact that revolutionary movements typically want to control the means of production. And the vehicle for this was the capture of the environmental movement, which has been mentioned. Now, prior to 1970, the environmental movement, in America at least, was concerned with, species survival, landscape preservation, clean air, clean water, and so on. Things that one normally would think of as in terms of environment. But a change occurred with the first Earth Day in 1970. And there, the focus turned to the energy sector. Of course, it's fundamental to all production, so that's a good leverage point. And relatedly, it involves trillions of dollars, which saving the whales does not. And that will turn out to be a fundamental feature. The new focus was accompanied by the creation of new environmental groups. In addition to capturing the old ones, there were things like environmental defense, now Environmental Defense Fund. I don't know why they changed the name. The Natural Resources Defense Council. It was also accompanied by new governmental organizations in the US. The Environmental Protection Agency was created by Nixon. You also had the Department of Transportation as a new thing. In any case, you also had the professional societies again. In my field, the American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union, and even the honorific societies like the National Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and so on. In the UK, the Royal Society was an easy takeover. When you began this issue of focusing on the energy, I would suggest there was a little bit of floundering around. People didn't quite know what to do. So you started with the fact that this metric, which is nonsense, of global mean energy change, was cooling from 1930s to this time in the 70s. And so you had the global cooling concern. The idea there was sulfate aerosols from burning coal were reflecting light and cooling the atmosphere, cooling the earth. And the cooling, how much? Okay. The cooling would end in the 70s. They tried to use the same thing to argue that acid rain was being caused by this, and you had the forest die off, and that also failed. And then when turned in the 70s to CO2. And CO2 was, element of the greenhouse effect, but controlling it was an obvious temptation for any control freak. I mean, after all, any burning of a fossil fuel, when you do it as cleanly as possible, will be left with CO2. Your breathing produces CO2. Your mouth has 40,000 parts per million instead of 400. So, you'd like to control that if you're a politician. I mean, that's controlling everything. The trouble was that doubling carbon dioxide would only give you about a degree because, water vapor and clouds were more important. And then came the rescue. Somebody discovered that if you used a one-dimensional model that was unrealistic and made an unrealistic assumption that relative humidity remained constant, water vapor would increase as CO2 warmed, doubling the effect of CO2 alone. So that would bring you to maybe 2 degrees. And soon it became what I call the stock and trade of all models, to find positive feedbacks that would amplify the effect of CO2. And you got it to 3 degrees and sometimes 4, although they're generally reckoned as unrealistic. And okay, so you now had that. This violated something called Le Chatelier's principle, which always said that natural systems that are long-lasting would tend to oppose change. But that was never rigorously proven, so positive feedback became the staple of the models. And there was enthusiasm that was boundless. I mean, this is where you had the virtue signaling elites saying we had to get rid of CO2 emissions, or zero emissions by maybe a decade or 2 or 3, with no idea of how to achieve this without destroying society. And of course, with offshore wind killing the mammals that you used to want to save. But ordinary people in America, at least, responded with good common sense. Most of them felt 3 degrees doesn't sound like much either. This is something you negotiate every day without thinking about. Why is it such a big deal? The odd thing about what I call the educated elites, us, is most of us are not going to be great creative figures, but we'll have been good students. And what does that mean? It means that we've learned to please our professors. And that has enabled us to develop a skill which is dangerous. We are able to rationalize anything, no matter how stupid. In any event, this, I think, explains why in the US, maybe as opposed to Europe, ordinary people, farmers, workers, and so on, tend generally to be skeptical of this issue and knowledgeable compared to the educated elite who support it blindly. In any event, one can continue, but I should end as soon as I can. And I should mention that, what are the things that I should? Yeah, it is the business that it's political, and once the ordinary people are no longer impressed by a degree or a half degree, the politicians became hysterical. You then saw a major switch, which all of you know. It no longer was that half degree was so important. It was that extreme events are due to climate change. Now, this is interesting because the first 5 UN reports all said they could find no relation between extreme events and climate. But the powers that be didn't care. What they knew is every day, someplace on Earth, there's an extreme event. And you can have a video of that and show it on television, and visuals have a much more important impact emotionally than a half degree. And that change, which contradicted the science, made perfectly clear it's political. Okay, let me just say something about the consensus, because it was always propagandistic, but it had its own interesting effects. I've often pointed out, in 1988, when this was rolled out in the US, Newsweek had a cover of the Earth on fire and the statement, "All scientists agree." This was at a time when there were about 5 institutions in America that were even looking at this. The main one was in the Soviet Union, and then called Leningrad. This didn't seem to matter, and this was again the issue I mentioned at the beginning, saying all scientists agreed gets people who don't know science comfortable with the issue, and it gives them something to be active about. At any rate, you had Al Gore and Clinton Gore come in. They increased the funding by a factor of 15. And that created a community now that was interested in climate, but they knew that they could only get one answer. And that made it even easier. In any event, you had something going on. Politicians would indicate what was the argument. Somebody would make an argument against climate. And let's say they said that it wasn't unprecedented. You had a medieval warm period. Word got out, who can get rid of the medieval warm period? And there would always be someone who would say, I can. And he would fudge the data and get off and be rewarded. Another was just asking, how can you attribute the little bit of temperature change we've seen to CO2? And in general, the IPCC for years was saying, we won't be able to do this for decades. And then somebody comes up and says, I could do it. And they do it in an absurd way. In any event, if you look at the IPCC, and I started with a statement, do your homework, what you find they're saying, and is that it will have an impact. Whereas their economists expect the GDP to go up 200% by 2100. Now they say it'll only go up 197. This does not sound like an existential threat to me. It should not be something that a teenage girl doesn't want to get married or have children because her life will end in 12 years. And yet that's what we're having.
Thank you, Professor.
Let me just one last sentence. So here we are, we're confronted with policies that destroy Western economies, impoverish the working middle class, condemn billions of the world's poorest to continued poverty and increased starvation, leave our children despairing over the alleged absence of a future, and will enrich the enemies of the West who are enjoying the spectacle of our suicide march, a march that the energy sector cowardly accepts, being too lazy to exert the modest effort needed to check what is being claimed. Voltaire, long ago, summed it up. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you.